Well, thank you very much indeed, High Commissioner, and it's great to be here. I'm grateful to the University of Ottawa and SIPS, your institute, for giving me this opportunity to talk, really just to define our terms. I think what we're talking about today is science for policy, not policy for science. Perhaps in the questions we may range into policy for science, but I'm going to try in my remarks to focus on science for policy. And let me begin by explaining where I fit in as the Minister for Universities and Science. And let me level with you, I am not a scientist. I greatly appreciate the tolerance of the scientific community in that they have a Minister for Science who's not a scientist. I have to say sometimes scientific expertise does get in the way. When we have, I'm going to try to give you some examples as we go through. When sitting around in the EU Council, we're discussing the problems of ITER, the great nuclear fusion project. If some of the science ministers in the EU are lay people like me, others are real experts, and a science minister who chips in and says, I'm not at all sure about the tokamak model of nuclear fusion. I've always thought that laser-based fusion is a better way forward. That kind of misses the point, and we all have to wait while the expert makes these comments, and then get back to the problem that we've got an international project whose costs are out of control. So sometimes, with the greatest respect, the science ministers who are themselves scientists can sometimes allow their particular expertise in some particular area to get in the way. For me, one of the challenges I notice and set for the scientist community is to explain what they're doing for me as a layman. And you do discover extraordinary diversity from some who are absolutely brilliant at communicating what they're doing to a lay person like me, and others who do find it hard to explain what they're up to. I am occasionally sort of treated as if I should be an expert. We have a program called Newsnight on BBC Two, presented by a formidable interviewer called Jeremy Paxman, who some of you may have heard of. And I remember I was there doing an interview on a different subject, on fairness between the generations, which I've written about. And he said to me, Mr. Willetts, you don't mind staying on. We've got a little film report from CERN, from the Large Hadron Collider. You'll be interested in that. So I sat lounging in my interviewee's chair as he showed the film clip. Then he turned to me and said, so, Mr. Willetts, what is the Higgs boson? And I said, well, you know, you need Brian Cox on to describe to you what the Higgs boson. And then he said, with a note of threat in his voice, Mr. Willetts, you are the science minister. What is the Higgs boson? We were live on air, I should add. We were live on air, and I managed to get, I was in danger of being a YouTube sensation, and I managed to struggle through it and offer an account which was just about credible. It was almost as bad as the time when I was doing a live interview for Sky after I'd announced that we were going to invest in reaction engines, which is a new air-breathing rocket engine. And 2 minutes before we went on air, Sky said, we thought we might begin by asking you to explain how it works. So there are challenges when occasionally people assume you should be an expert, but I try not to be. But what I do hope I am, and what I do, the crucial value that I share with the scientific community, I hope I am an empiricist who believes in evidence and evidence shaping what we do. And fortunately, one of the reasons why science in Britain is very good is that we have what's called the Haldane principle, which says that it is not the job of the science minister to decide between specific projects. Those are determined, those crucial judgments about exactly what should be financed, who should get the Research Council grant, which universities should get more research funding, are not determined by politicians or the science minister. They're determined by the science community within a framework that we set, and I think that is the right way to do things. I am fortunate in that although our department, the business department where I'm located, has its Secretary of State, Vince Cable, from a different political party. I get on very well with Vince. Don't mind being quoted on that. Get on very well with Vince. I also have a place in the Cabinet as the Minister for Universities and Science. That does mean that I can chip in all the discussions we have. And again, the other week, we were discussing flooding. We have a serious problem of flooding in Britain at the moment. And I thought the obvious point was not being made. So I said, you know, what the scientists say to me, and again, I'm the layman, so I can report it on in a way that I hope my colleagues would get, is that what climate change has done is it's put the weather on steroids. There is more energy in the atmosphere. There is more energy in the oceans. That means we are more prone to extreme weather events. and you can try to chip in from the science perspective when these things are being discussed. So that's where I fit in. Alongside me, there is the chief scientist. We've had a chief scientist in Britain since 1964. We're about to celebrate 50th anniversary. It was earlier on in my time as Minister, it was Sir John Beddington. It's now Sir Mark Walpert. Both of them people with whom I had an excellent working relationship. They do not work for me. In fact, they directly report to the Prime Minister, but they're located in my department. They're in the same building, and anything that they send into the Prime Minister, they would copy to me and quite possibly discuss or inform with me in advance. If there is something where a proper expert scientific input is required, they will be invited to come to Cabinet to report to us or to one of our Cabinet committees. So, for example, during the Fukushima crisis, when we needed to know exactly what advice should be given to diplomats and tourists and British people living in Japan and how serious it was, for several of those cabinets, John Beddington came to present on our latest assessment of the significance of Fukushima. And interestingly, on the basis of that advice from John Beddington and the scientists, we did not advise that our embassy staff or visitors living in Tokyo should leave Tokyo. Our assessment, our objective assessment, was that the danger was not so great they should leave Tokyo. And the Japanese government are very aware of the governments which pulled their staff out and the governments which did not pull their staff out. And the experience of our acting on independent advice from the chief scientist is one of the reasons why now the Japanese government are interested in creating something like that chief scientific advisor post for them. We have an emergency, one of the subcommittees of Cabinet is COBRA, which is the Civil Contingencies Emergency Planning Staff, and the chief scientist will be brought into those discussions and indeed can chair his own group called SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, when you do need a serious scientific input. And that was activated, for example, during the H1N1 influenza pandemic in 2009, or more recently, the Icelandic volcano eruption with the ash clouds, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it. So we can draw on scientific advice from the chief science advisor as an independent voice. I will often work with the chief science advisor on areas where we both need to communicate. So last Friday, we did a joint press conference at the Science Media Centre, which is an independent host for science media briefings, on the use of animals in research. The coalition has got a commitment to work to reduce the use of animals in research. So I was there to explain what we are doing to deliver on that in policy terms and the extra funding we are putting into the reduction, refinement, replacement of animals wherever possible. Sir Mark Walpert was there to give some really powerful independent science evidence as to how there are circumstances when, however high your standards and whatever you do, you are going to need to use animals in research. And he was able to say, if we're to tackle Alzheimer's, if we're to research antibiotic resistance, you do need the use of animals, often now mice or fish, and indeed you can also, especially using genetic techniques, you may be able to use mice in future for tests that were done on higher order animals in the past. And when we're talking to, say, the Chinese about their requirements that cosmetics be tested on animals, when we in the UK do not permit the testing of cosmetics on animals, and indeed that's now the position across the EU, it's better if it's not politicians having this argument, it is scientists from the UK, science advisors explaining the steps that we've taken and why we don't believe that that is necessary. The chief scientist also and his office also run foresight exercises when they try to do long-term assessments of issues coming up on the horizon, advanced manufacturing. They're currently doing one on a topic I've just been speaking at another seminar, smart cities, how smart cities are changing. Alongside the chief scientist and his office located, as I say, in my department, though not under direct control of the ministers in my department. There is a network of chief science advisors in every department. Some of them are outside appointments brought in because it's a department that has a large amount of engagement with science. The DEFRA, the Environment and Agriculture Department, or the MOD. Sometimes if there's a department that has less direct involvement in science issues, it'll be an internal appointment, that's someone with a scientific background who has the post of chief science advisor within that department. Their influence varies depending often on the amount of science that the department deals with. And one thing I can do is nudge one of my colleagues around the cabinet table to make sure, if I think there is some useful science advice coming in or some science work that's happening that they need to be aware of, encouraging them to hear from their own chief scientist. And the network of scientists headed by the chief scientist meet together once a week over breakfast to compare notes on what's happening, pool information, and I'm sure provide mutual support when they're talking about the things that we politicians get up to sometimes. So there is a good network there. I'm trying to take you through the structure as quickly as I can. So there's a Minister for Science, there is the Chief Science, and a network of science advisors in every, chief scientists in every department. Then, as you sort of carry on through the penumbra, there are science advisory committees, who are groups of expert scientists, maybe now not on the staff of departments, outside experts working in universities or research institutes who give advice on tricky and delicate issues. And they can get caught up in very tricky issues. Drugs, for example, and the debate about the legalization or otherwise of drugs, which Professor David Nutt, a case that he famously got involved in, known in the trade as the Nutt case. He, in many ways, led, it happened under the previous government, and he was entitled to his views on drugs. He absolutely was. I think what everybody learned from that episode is that people hadn't quite worked out what you could say if you were also advising the government and in some sense had a privileged position as an official advisor to the government. And we've now got a document, a fuller document than ever before, Principles of Scientific Advice to Government, which makes it clear that you have an absolute right to advise ministers as frankly and honestly on exactly your assessment. But equally, in return, you need, for the place at the table, you need to respect that ministers have the ultimate right to decide, balancing the points you make with other points, which includes, just as we're democratically elected, what we think is acceptable and part of the culture and values of the society around us and the people who elect us. And what we have now done under this government is that we have strengthened the parallel document for ministers, questions of procedure for ministers, which are basically the rules which ministers have to comply with as we do our job, and lots of rules about a whole range of subjects. And that now, more explicitly than ever before, says that we have to have regard to the advice that we get from the scientific community and the science advisory committees. So that's how the structure works within government, on the penumbra of government. Very briefly, just to finish it off with the more external bodies. We have a Council for Science and Technology, which is co-chaired by the Chief Scientist and an outsider, currently Nancy Rothwell, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Manchester, which brings together outside experts, Vice-Chancellors of universities, leading researchers and scientists. And it's a fantastic resource for us because essentially they advise the government, they choose topics where they think we need to get further advice, and they write letters to the Prime Minister on these topics, which they choose. I might sometimes say to them, this is a hot topic, have you got anything to say? Other times they will just choose for themselves something they think we need to focus on. They'll write to the Prime Minister, copy to me, the letter will then be put up on the website. Recent subjects have been algorithms, just exactly what our comparative advantage is in the UK, what more we can do on IT and software, the teaching of science in schools, medical education, smart grids and how we take the opportunity of smart grids and what the technologies are around smart grids. Very useful, and we're incredibly fortunate to have essentially these people giving their time and expertise and producing advice in a form that a lay person can understand. And they will have a meeting with the Prime Minister once a year and meetings with others of us during the year. Within Parliament, there is POST, the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, which provides advice for MPs. In some ways, it's the parallel structure. If you think of the chief scientist and his structure as giving advice to the executive, POST is what gives advice to the legislature. And I would say of the various activities they engage in, the two that really I would probably rank most highly are, first of all, what they call post notes, which are, again, accounts for lay people, accounts for busy MPs, when there's a topic which is part of political debate on trying to make sense of it for a layman, taking them through the issues. And as well as that, and this really helps the science community, because much though I respect, indeed love the science community, just occasionally scientists are a bit naive about public policy and the trade-offs that you make in public policy. So just as we in public policy have to understand and respect scientists, so scientists, I think, sometimes have to understand the constraints and the way in which public policy has to be formulated. And there is a program of fellowships for people doing science PhDs in our universities, who in their second or third year can spend 6 months in post, and they can be writing briefs and seeing politics in its wildest, reddest, bloodiest form in the House of Commons, and I'm sure it's very good for them and they enjoy going back to the laboratory afterwards. So we have fellowships for students, doctoral students at post. And then finally, and this is the right point to end, because I'm very pleased that I've got with me in my delegation Mary from the University of Edinburgh, and as well as that, the Senior Vice Principal of the University of Edinburgh, and Martin Polyakov from the Royal Society. We have good links with our learned societies and universities. And the Royal Society, for example, produces excellent work. I think, for example, of a document now that came out in 2012, Science as an Open Enterprise, which is a really serious piece of work that has had a big impact on the way we approach issues like open access to research findings, the open data agenda. And we would informally or formally consult our learned societies on major policy issues, certainly affecting science, but ranging more widely. There are, and as well as the Royal Society, there's the British Academy, more on the humanities and social sciences side. There's the Academy of Medical Sciences, the Royal Academy of Engineering. So there are 4 in all, but the Royal Society is the kind of the oldest of the lot. And I would encourage, and I do try to encourage the Royal Society to make sure that the scientific voice is heard as much as possible on the hot topics of the day, on GM or climate change, because there is sometimes a temptation for those debates to be shaped by our views of the policy consequences rather than what the scientific evidence says. So we've got and when we had the G8 Science Summit last summer, it was great for it to be held at the Royal Society, co-chaired with myself and Professor Sir Paul Nurse, the President of the Royal Society. So we work with our learning societies, and they have absolutely the right to speak up independently. They're independent and historic organizations. So that's our ecosystem for science for policy. Nothing is perfect. Every country will have their own way of doing things. There are different models around the world. There is no one right way of doing it. As I go around the world, I observe lots of different models. Ours is still changing and developing, but I think it has ensured that the voice of scientific evidence is properly heard at the heart of government, as it should be. Thank you very much indeed.